The forge had gone cold by the second week of November 1852, and Samuel Holloway stood inside his own workshop like a man inside his own grave. He was 50 years old that winter. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 35 of those years swinging a hammer against iron. The knuckles were thick. The fingers were short. The skin on the backs of them had been burned and healed and burned again so many times it had taken on the color of old leather. Those hands were trembling now, and Sam Holloway did not know what to do about it. In his right hand, he held a broken saw blade. The teeth had snapped clean off the back third of the blade during a cut on Calvin Pickering's place the week before, and Calvin had walked the blade over to the forge the next morning with the kind of patient politeness that frontier men wore when they wanted to tell another man he was failing. Sam had taken the blade. Sam had said he would fix it. And now 3 days later, he was standing in his cold workshop with no quality steel left in his stock. Barrel no replacement, teeth blanks, no flux, no temper oil that had not gone rancid in the autumn damp. 3 men waited outside his door. He could hear them stamping their boots in the snow. Sam Holloway closed his eyes. He thought for the first time in many years of a woman he had insulted in the spring of 1848. He thought of her quiet face when she had closed the door of her cabin in his face. He thought of what she had said about his blades. He set the broken saw blade down on the cold anvil. He walked to the front door of the forge, and he opened it just wide enough to put his head out. "Gentlemen, come back next week. I will have steel by then." He did not have steel. He did not know where he would find steel. But he closed the door and he stood with his back pressed against the rough oak boards, and he understood in a way he had not allowed himself to understand for 6 years that the woman he needed was the woman he had spent 6 years pretending not to need. He did not know on that cold November morning that within a fortnight, the warehouse of a man in Freeport would burn to the ground, and the wagon road through Douglas Gap would already be impassable, and the entire settlement of Hollow Creek would be facing a winter without supplies. He did not know that the day was coming faster than he could have guessed when he would walk 3 hours before dawn to a cabin on the far side of the village with the last bar of tool steel in a shop under his arm and an apology 12,000 words long sitting unspoken in his chest. The story of how Samuel Holloway came to be standing in his cold forge on that morning with that blade in his hand and that knowledge in his heart begins 6 years earlier and 400 miles to the east. She stepped off the dock at Philadelphia on the 17th of April, 1846. She was 34 years old. The dock was wet from the morning rain. Her 2 trunks sat behind her, and her grandmother's stone mortar sat between them, and $42 in coins sat sewn into the hem of her traveling dress. Her husband Andrew lay 600 fathoms beneath the Atlantic Ocean, 2 days west of the Irish coast, where the ship's crew had wrapped him in canvas and weighted him with iron and dropped him over the side while the chaplain read words she could not hear over the wind. Andrew Kinsley had been a shipyard carpenter in Glasgow. He had saved coin for 4 years to bring his wife to America. He had died of pleurisy on the 5th night out, coughing pink foam onto a wool blanket that Margaret had carried up from steerage. The ship's cook, a man named Donnelly, who had known Andrew from the Clyde docks, gave her a small sack of black tea on the morning the ship reached Philadelphia. He told her in a voice that broke at the seams that the Scots who had gone before her to the western country had done well enough if they were willing to work for it. Margaret thanked him in the soft, careful English she had been practicing since she was a child. She picked up her trunks. She walked off the gangplank into a country she had never seen. She would not see the Atlantic Ocean again. She bought her piece of land at Hollow Creek 6 weeks later in the first hot days of June. The seller was a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer named Cornelius Hargrove, who was 81 years old that summer and who was leaving the place because his three sons had gone west to Ohio and he did not have the strength to keep the farm alone. The men at the Freeport land office called him Old Neil. He was a small man with a white beard that reached the top button of his shirt and eyes that had seen the country change from forest to farm and back again twice in his lifetime. He showed Margaret the cabin. He showed her the spring. He showed her the south-facing slope where the oats would grow. Then he walked her around behind the cabin and stopped in front of a low stone outbuilding with a slate roof and a heavy oak door bound in iron. He stood there with his hat in his hands and he did not speak for a long while. "Do you know what makes this shed worth keeping, Mrs. Kinsley?" he said at last. She looked at the building. She looked at the fieldstone walls, which were 3 feet thick at the base. She looked at the door, which had been forged in Lancaster County by a smith who knew his work. She looked at the slate roof, which had not leaked in 20 years. "The walls, Mr. Hargrove, they will keep the rats out." Old Neil shook his head. "No, ma'am, not the walls, not the roof, it is the door. A man builds a stone shed to keep what other men want to take. The question is not whether the shed is strong. The question is whether you have anything inside worth a thief's trouble. Do you have anything worth keeping, Mrs. Kinsley?" Margaret looked at the old man for a long moment. She thought of her father in Aberdeen. She thought of the small leather-bound notebook in her smaller trunk. She thought of what she had learned in the hungry winters of the early 1840s. "I will, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I will." Old Neil nodded once. He handed her the iron key. He did not say goodbye when he left. He simply walked down the wagon road toward Freeport, and Margaret never saw him again. He died of a fever in Cincinnati the following autumn. She would learn this from the postmaster 2 years later, and she would mark the date in the back of her father's notebook because Cornelius Hargrove was the first man in America who had looked at her and seen what she was, and she did not intend to forget him. To understand why Margaret Kinsley would carry buckets along the footpaths of Hollow Creek for 6 years asking her neighbors for the very things they were throwing away, you must understand her father. Duncan Kinsley had been a candle maker in the city of Aberdeen on the cold northeast coast of Scotland. He had been a small man with stooped shoulders and a soft voice in the hands of a craftsman who could render tallow without scorching a single drop. He had taught his daughter from the time she was old enough to stand on a wooden stool beside the kettle the slow chemistry of fat and flame. He had taught her how to test the strength of lye by floating an egg in the solution. He had taught her how to grind charred bone into a meal so fine it would settle into the planting holes of a kitchen garden and bring up tomatoes through the driest August. He had taught her how to mix dyes from lichen and iron pots, and how to compound a waterproofing for boots from rendered tallow beeswax and pine pitch in proportions she could recite before she could read. But the thing Duncan Kinsley had given his daughter, the thing that mattered more than any of the formulas, was a memory she had carried out of the winter of 1838 and never set down. The potato had failed across Aberdeenshire that year. It would fail across all of Scotland and Ireland in the years that followed in a famine that would empty whole counties and send 1 million people across the sea. But in 1838, the failure was local. Aberdeenshire alone and the small villages outside Aberdeen, where men and women were beginning to learn that the food they had eaten for 2 generations could vanish from the fields in a single summer. Duncan Kinsley had walked the village paths that winter with a bucket. He had asked for ash from the hearths. He had asked for bones from the stew pots. He had asked for the scraps of fat that the housewives skimmed and discarded. And he had carried these things back to a small stone outbuilding behind his candle shop. And he had made soap and bone meal fertilizer and boot dressing from them, and he had given these things away free of charge to any family in the village who came to his door. He saved 37 families that winter. Margaret had counted them later when she was old enough to understand. 37 households in 17 villages who would have lost a child or two or three to disease and cold and hunger if Duncan Kinsley had not been carrying buckets while his neighbors carried nothing. And in the spring of 1840, when the worst had passed and the gardens were coming up green again, a man named Hamish McCrae had walked into Duncan Kinsley's shed in the night with three of his cousins and a wooden cudgel, because he believed that Duncan had been hoarding materials for his own profit and because he had decided that what Duncan had collected belonged by rights to the village. Duncan had fought them. He had been 44 years old and not a strong man, and he had fought them anyway because the shed was his work and his life and the memory of the winter he had saved. McCrae had broken Duncan's left leg with the cudgel below the knee, and the bone had set wrong, and Duncan Kinsley had walked with a cane for the 17 years he had left to live. Margaret had been 18 when it happened. She had heard the noise. She had run from the house with her mother and found her father bleeding in the doorway of the shed and the four cousins gone with what they could carry. She had helped her mother set the bone. She had nursed her father through the long fever that followed. And 6 months later, in the soft Aberdeen autumn of 1840, her father had called her into his small office above the candle shop, and he had put into her hands a leather-bound notebook, brown and worn, with his careful copperplate handwriting filling every page. "Margaret, my darling girl, listen to me now." She had sat down on the wooden stool beside his chair. "People do not forgive those who know what they themselves do not know. Remember that. They do not forgive you for being right when they have been wrong. They will laugh at you. They will call you names. They will perhaps do worse. I have learned this in my own bones, and you have seen it with your own eyes." She had nodded. She could not speak. "But do not let it stop you. The work is the thing. The work outlives the mockery. The work outlives the men with cudgels. Promise me, Margaret. Promise me you will keep the work." She had promised. He had given her the notebook. 6 years later, she had carried it across the Atlantic in her smaller trunk, wrapped in oiled cloth between 2 layers of her wedding linens, and she had carried it to a stone shed in western Pennsylvania, and she had begun her own collection in the country where her dead husband had wanted her to make a new life. She did not tell anyone in Hollow Creek about her father. She did not tell them about McCrae. She did not tell them about the 17 years her father had walked with a cane. She had learned from him that explaining was wasted breath. The work was the thing. The work would speak when the moment came. She began carrying buckets in the autumn of her first year. She did not start with bones, she started with ash. She walked to the cabin of Hester Pickering on a cool October morning with her yoke across her shoulders and 2 oak pails swinging at her sides, and she asked Hester Pickering whether she could have the cold ash from the kitchen hearth. Hester Pickering was 32 years old that autumn. She had a husband named Calvin, who was 44 and ran a small farm on the south side of the creek, and she had 3 children. The middle one was a boy named Wesley, who was 3 years old that autumn, and who would shortly figure in this story in a way none of them could have guessed. The youngest was a girl named Nora, who was 4. The oldest was a boy named Thomas, who would die of typhoid in 1855, and whom we will not see again in this account. Hester gave Margaret the ash. She did not ask why. The Scots widow had a way about her that did not invite questions. Margaret thanked her, lifted the yoke, and walked away. That night, Hester told her husband about it, and Calvin Pickering, who had a wide, friendly face and a habit of repeating his stories at the sawmill, the next morning told the men at the mill, and one of the men at the mill that morning was Samuel Holloway. Sam Holloway thought about it while he worked the bellows. He thought about it while he ate his noon meal. And at the end of the day, when he was walking home with two other men, he said with the easy cruelty of a man who had not yet learned to listen to his own voice, "The Scotswoman has a rubbish shed back behind her cabin. That is what she has, a rubbish shed." The name traveled. By the end of the week, every man at the sawmill called it that. By the end of the month, every child in Hollow Creek called it that. By the end of the autumn, when the bones from the first pig slaughter went home with Margaret in a covered crock, the rubbish shed had become the village's running joke, and the woman who kept it had become the village's running puzzle. Margaret heard the name. She heard it from the lips of Wesley Pickering. One spring morning when the boy was 5 years old and out at the creek with his cousins. She heard it from the lips of the Whitfield boys at the crossroads. She heard it from one of the men at the sawmill who said it to her face one afternoon as she walked past with her empty buckets, the way a man says a thing when he wants to see if a woman will flinch. She did not flinch. She walked on. But there was one child in Hollow Creek who did not laugh at the name of the rubbish shed, and that child was Nora Pickering, the daughter of Hester and Calvin, who had been 4 years old when Margaret first carried ash out of her mother's kitchen, and who was 10 years old in the spring of 1847 when she walked past Margaret's cabin one afternoon and saw the Scots widow washing bones in a copper pot in the yard. Nora stopped at the edge of the yard. She watched. Margaret looked up. "Hello, Nora." "Hello, Mrs. Kinsley. Are you on your way somewhere?" "To the creek, to fetch water." Nora did not move. She was looking at the bones. They were pig bones mostly, a few cattle ribs, a small skull that might have been a fox. "Mrs. Kinsley, why do you keep the bones?" Margaret put down the bone she was holding. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the small, thin girl standing in her yard, and something moved in her chest that had not moved in many months, and she chose her answer very carefully. "Because bones sing, Nora, if you listen long enough." The girl's eyes widened. "What do they sing?" "I will tell you one day, when you are old enough to hear it." Nora Pickering carried her bucket of creek water home that afternoon. She did not tell her mother about the conversation. She did not tell her father. She began to walk past Margaret's cabin every day on her way to the creek, and every few weeks she would stop and Margaret would say a word to her and the girl would say a word back. It was not friendship, not yet. It was the beginning of something that would take 5 years to bloom and would in the end save the village. The trouble that summer came from Mabel Whitfield, and it came on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1847 in the front room of Joseph Tillman's general store at the crossroads. Margaret had walked the mile from her cabin with a basket of eggs over her arm. The eggs were her own from the 6 brown hens she kept in the hen house behind the cabin. She intended to trade them for salt. She needed salt for the curing of the autumn hams she had agreed to do for Hester Pickering, who had 4 hams to cure and no salt liquor of her own. Joe Tillman was behind the counter. Mabel Whitfield was at the dry goods shelf. There were 2 other women in the store, one of them, young Sadie Ashford, who had come to fetch a packet of needles for her mother, and the other of them, Lucinda Holloway, the wife of Sam, who was buying a pound of coffee for her husband's supper. Mabel Whitfield was the wife of Garrett Whitfield, who owned the largest farm in Hollow Creek, and she was a tall, thin woman of 50 with a sharp jaw and a sharper tongue. She turned around when Margaret came in. She looked at the basket of eggs. She looked at Margaret's apron, which was clean. She looked at Margaret's hands, which were also clean. And she said in a voice that carried easily to every corner of the small store, "Are your eggs clean, Mrs. Kinsley? Or do you keep them with the bones and the urine?" The store went silent. Joe Tillman did not look up. Sadie Ashford stared at her shoes. Lucinda Holloway, who would later in life become Margaret's quiet friend, opened her mouth to say something and then closed it again. The two cats that lived in the rafters of Joe Tillman's store had a habit of dropping down from the beams when a fight started, and one of them, an orange Tom named Patches, did exactly that, now landing on the wood plank floor with a soft thump that nobody acknowledged. Margaret set the basket of eggs down on the counter. She did it slowly. She did not turn red. She did not raise her voice. "Mr. Tillman, I will return another day." She picked up her basket again. The eggs went with her. She walked past Mabel Whitfield without looking at her. She walked out of the store. She walked the mile home with her basket on her arm and her head down, and when she reached her cabin, she put the eggs in her cold cellar, and she sat on her wooden chair beside the kitchen table, and she did not cry, but she sat very still for a long while. She did not buy salt at Joe Tillman's store for 2 years after that day. She bought it from a peddler who came through twice a year from Pittsburgh at a higher price, and she paid the difference without complaint. Joe Tillman would remember the silence in his store, the silence he had not broken, and he would carry the memory of that silence to the end of his life, and it would shape the way he treated certain people in the years to come. But that is a matter for later. In July of 1847, all that mattered was that Margaret Kinsley walked home with a basket of unsold eggs, and that she sat at her kitchen table, and that she did not weep. The winter of 1847 to 1848 was an early one. The first snow fell on the 8th of November, and by the second week of January, the snow was 4 feet deep in the hollows, and the wind off the high pine ridge cut through wool like a saw blade through cheese. It was on the night of the 17th of January, in the worst week of that winter, that Wesley Pickering had his accident. He was 5 years old that winter. He was a quiet boy with thick brown hair and a serious way of looking at the world. His father, Calvin, had been repairing the door of the corn crib behind the barn, and Calvin had set down a heavy iron mallet on the top of a low stack of split firewood while he went into the house to fetch his coat. He had told Wesley to stay away from the mallet. Wesley had stayed away from the mallet for almost 5 minutes, which is a long time for a 5-year-old boy. Then he had climbed up onto the firewood to look at the mallet more closely, and the firewood had shifted beneath him, and the mallet had come down on his right leg below the knee. The mallet weighed 9 pounds. It opened a gash in the boy's leg that ran from the kneecap to the shin, and it laid the shin back to the bone in 2 places, and the blood that came out of it was the dark blood of a deep wound, and it did not stop. Calvin Pickering came running when he heard the screaming. He carried his son into the kitchen. Hester wrapped the leg in clean cotton. The cotton soaked through in 8 minutes. They wrapped it again. It soaked through in 10. The doctor who served Hollow Creek lived in Freeport, 12 miles away, and the doctor was on that particular night sitting at the bedside of a dying woman in Tarentum, and would not return to Freeport for 2 more days. Hester Pickering looked at her husband. Calvin looked at his son. "I am going," Hester said. "I am going to the Scott's widow." Calvin's face went hard. "Hester, do not." "Calvin, he is going to bleed to death." "He will not." "He is." She did not wait for him to answer. She put on her boots. She put on her heaviest coat. She walked the half-mile through the snow to Margaret Kinsley's cabin, and she knocked on the door, and when Margaret opened it, Hester stood on the threshold, and she said, my boy is bleeding, and the doctor is gone." Margaret did not ask a single question. She put on her coat. She took the iron key from its hook by the door. She walked across the yard to the stone shed and unlocked the door, and Hester, in the lantern light, saw for the first time what was inside the shed. She saw the long racks of shelves against the north wall. She saw the labeled barrels against the east wall. She saw the leather hanging in graded sizes against the south wall. She saw the small iron stove and the workbench and the careful Highland script on every crock and bag and box. She did not have time to understand what she was seeing. Margaret took a small brown crock from the third shelf and a roll of dried sphagnum moss from the fourth, and a folded square of clean linen from a wooden chest by the door. She locked the shed again. She walked back to the cabin with Hester. They went together to the Pickering farm through the snow. Margaret did not speak to Calvin. She knelt beside Wesley on the kitchen table where Hester had laid him. She cleaned the wound with hot water and a soft cloth. She packed the deep places with the dried sphagnum moss, which the old Highland midwives had used for 1,000 years because it absorbed blood and resisted infection. She spread the brown ointment from the crock over the pew, and cut the ointment her mother had taught her to compound from rendered bone marrow and yarrow and willow bark and the careful, slow heat of a copper pan. She wrapped the leg in clean linen. She tied the linen with strips of cotton that Hester gave her. By 3 in the morning, the bleeding had stopped. By 4, the boy was sleeping. By 6, he was breathing evenly. Margaret brewed a tea of yarrow leaves and gave half a cup to Hester to spoon into the child's mouth every hour through the morning. She left the Pickering farm at sunrise. She did not say goodbye to Calvin. She walked home through the snow with her empty crock and her unused linen and her hands smelling of yarrow. 3 hours later, Calvin Pickering put on his coat and walked to her cabin. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands. She opened the door. "Mrs. Kinsley, Mr. Pickering, I want to thank you for what you did." "Your wife thanked me. I want to thank you myself." "Then you have." He stood there for a long moment. The snow had begun to fall again. Small flakes were settling on the brim of his hat. He looked at his boots. He looked at the porch rail. He did not look at her face. "Mrs. Kinsley, I would ask you a favor." "Yes." "I would ask you not to speak of this to anyone, ever. I would ask that my wife not speak of this either. The boy will heal. People will say he was lucky. Let them say so. I do not want it known that I sent for you." Margaret looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She looked at him for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was the face of a man drowning in shame, and she understood in that moment more about Calvin Pickering than Calvin Pickering would ever understand about himself. "Mr. Pickering, I will not speak of it. Your wife will not speak of it. The shame is yours to carry, not the boy's. Go home and tend to your son." She closed the door. Calvin walked home through the snow. Hester Pickering carried the secret for the next 4 years, and the carrying of it would crack something inside her marriage that would not be repaired until a December night, many years later, on which she would knock again on Margaret Kinsley's door, and Margaret would open it, and the 4 years of silence would come apart in the kitchen lamplight. But that is a matter for later. In the spring of 1848, in the 4th week of April, while the snow was melting and the dogwoods were beginning to bud at the edge of the woods, Samuel Holloway walked up the wagon road to Margaret Kinsley's cabin with the appointed mission of telling her to clean up her yard. He had been sent by Garrett Whitfield, who had not asked him to come, but had complained the previous Sunday after church that something ought to be said to the widow. Sam Holloway had volunteered. He had volunteered because he was a direct man, and he believed that direct men did direct things, and he had not yet learned in his 50 years of life that directness was very often the disguise that ignorance wore in public. He stopped at the edge of the yard. He did not step onto the porch. He took off his hat because his mother had raised him to take off his hat when addressing a woman, and he stood in the wet grass with the brim crushed in his fist. "Mrs. Kinsley, may I have a word?" She came out onto the porch. She did not sit. She did not invite him to sit. "Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Kinsley, I will be plain. The shed of yours is making the women of the settlement uneasy. The children will not walk past your place after dark. My own wife says the smell of the place reaches the crossroads on a south wind. I am asking you as a neighbor to clear out the worst of what you have in there, or to do something to make the place less of a thorn in the side of the village. Margaret looked at him for what felt like a long time. The wind moved a strand of gray hair across her cheek and she did not push it back. Mr. Holloway, may I ask you a question? You may. Do you know why your saw blades keep cracking? Sam Holloway's face went red. He had not expected the conversation to turn this way. The cracking of his saw blades was not a subject he discussed in public. He had been losing blades for 2 years. He could not understand why. He had thought it was the Pittsburgh steel. The Pittsburgh steel is sometimes ill-tempered. I have written to the foundry about it. It is not the steel, Mr. Holloway. It is the way you draw the temper. You are bringing them up too fast. The grain crystallizes wrong. If you hold the blade at a deep straw color for 3 minutes longer and quench it in oil rather than water, you will not crack another blade for a year. He stared at her. She went on in the same calm voice. My father taught me how to test the heat of steel by the color of the metal in the firelight. When you are ready to learn, you may come and ask. Until then, Mr. Holloway, I have work to do. Good morning. She turned. She went into her cabin. The door closed behind her with a soft and final sound. Sam Holloway stood in the wet grass for a long time. He stood there for what he later remembered as 5 full minutes, though it may have been less. His face was hot. His hands were shaking. He put his hat back on. He walked home. He did not tell Lucinda about the conversation. He did not tell Garrett Whitfield. He did not tell anyone. But that night, after his wife had gone to bed, he sat in front of the banked fire in his hearth, and he watched the coals, and he thought about the color of steel in the firelight, and he thought about a deep straw color held for 3 minutes longer and quenched in oil rather than water, and he did not sleep until the rooster crowed at 4. The autumn of 1849 came on cold and dry. In the second week of September, an old farmer named Briggs walked through Hollow Creek on his way from Tarentum to Kittanning, and he stopped at Joe Tillman's store for tobacco. And he mentioned in passing that the wild geese had been flying south 3 weeks earlier than he had ever known them to fly. He had been watching the geese for 60 years. He said it would be a hard winter, the kind of winter that broke things. Margaret Kinsley was standing at the counter trading bread for salt when Briggs said it. She did not look up. She did not show anything in her face. But that night in her cabin, she opened her father's brown leather notebook and she began to do arithmetic on a scrap of paper. She counted households. She counted children. She counted pounds. 2 miles away in his forge at the edge of the village, Sam Holloway stood beside his fire and watched a fresh blade glow deep straw color in the coals. He held it. He counted 3 minutes longer than he had ever held a blade before. He took it out. He plunged it into a tub of linseed oil. The steel hissed. The smoke curled up around his face. He pulled the blade out a minute later and laid it on the anvil. It rang true. He tapped the back of it with a small hammer and the note was clean and high and steady. He had not cracked a blade in 14 months. He stood there in the red light of the forge with the new blade in his hands. He thought about a Scottish widow who had closed her door in his face. He thought about a quiet voice on a wet porch in April of 1848. And his hands began to tremble, and he set the blade down on the anvil, and he did not understand yet what was beginning to happen inside him. But it had begun. The girl was 13 years old, and she was committing a crime. Nora Pickering stood barefoot on the cold pine floor of her mother's kitchen in the gray hour before dawn on a Tuesday in April of 1850, and she stirred a small iron pot of melted hog fat with a wooden spoon, she had stolen from the butter churn. The kitchen window was still dark. Her mother slept in the next room. Her father had left at 4 to walk his trap line in the bottomland along the creek. Her brother Thomas was asleep in the loft. Her younger sister was asleep in the trundle by the hearth. In her left hand, Nora held a tin cup of pale gray liquid she had leached from the cold ashes of the hearth 3 days before. She had hidden the cup behind the wood box. She had checked it every morning. The egg she had set floating in it the day before had risen high enough that a patch of shell the size of a thimble had broken the surface, and she had known by that small sign alone that her preparation was finally strong enough. She had read about the test in nothing. She had heard about it from a Scots widow at the edge of the village who had spoken of it once in a kitchen in the dead of winter 2 years before to a desperate woman who had not understood what she was hearing. Nora had been in the next room. Nora had been 6 years old. Nora had remembered. She poured the liquid into the fat. She stirred. She watched the mixture froth and darken and begin to thicken. Her hands were trembling. She did not know if she was about to make soap or burn her mother's only good iron pot. The first batch was wrong. She had used too much of the gray liquid, and the result turned out hard and brittle and so caustic that it raised a welt on the back of her hand when she touched it. She buried it in the kitchen garden behind the henhouse and prayed her mother would not find it. The second batch was also wrong. She had not stirred it long enough. It separated overnight into a layer of pale yellow fat sitting on top of a pool of gray water, and she had to bury that one too. The third batch in the 3rd week of May came out the color of old ivory. It smelled faintly of wood smoke. It was the size of 2 of her fists. She wrapped it in a piece of clean cotton, and she hid it under her straw tick mattress in the loft, and she did not tell a living soul. She was the first student Margaret Kinsley did not know she had. The second student arrived in the same season, but he was older, and he was a boy, and he came in by an entirely different door. Jonas Holloway was 15 years old in the spring of 1850. He was the only son of Samuel and Lucinda Holloway, and he was a tall, thin boy with his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's quiet eyes. He had grown up smelling the iron and the charcoal and the linseed oil of the forge, and he had been swinging a small hammer beside his father's anvil since he was 8 years old. He intended when he was a man to take over his father's business. But the boy had a curiosity in him that his father had never had, and on a warm afternoon in the 2nd week of June, when he was walking back from the creek with a string of 3 bass over his shoulder, he passed the yard of the Scots widow, and he saw her standing at her workbench in the open door of the stone shed, pressing yellow wax from a wooden frame. He stopped at the edge of the road. He watched her for 2 full minutes. She did not look up. She knew he was there. Finally, he said very quietly, "Mrs. Kinsley, may I come closer?" She set down the frame. She looked at him. She looked at him for what felt to Jonas Holloway like a very long time. He saw in her face the calculation of a woman who knew exactly whose son was standing at her gate. "Does your father know where you are, Jonas?" "No, ma'am." "Then come in." He came in. She showed him the wax frame. She showed him how the comb separated from the honey when you pressed it slowly through the heat of an afternoon sun. She did not show him the inside of the shed that day, but she let him stand at the workbench and beside her for half an hour. And when he left with the 3 bass still over his shoulder and the smell of the wax still on his hands, she said, "Jonas, if you come back, come at this hour. Your father takes his nap at this hour. He will not miss you." He came back the next Tuesday. He came back the Tuesday after that. By the end of August, he had been to her shed 11 times, and he had learned in those 11 afternoons more about the practical chemistry of small things than he had learned in 15 years of life at his father's forge. Margaret Kinsley did not show him her father's notebook. She did not tell him about Aberdeenshire. She simply taught him the work slowly one Tuesday at a time, and she watched him grow, and she said nothing to anyone. His father did not know. His mother did not know. The boy carried the secret the way Margaret had carried her father's notebook across the Atlantic, wrapped in oiled cloth and pressed against his ribs. The trouble that summer came at the village council in the meeting house on the evening of the 23rd of May, 1850. The official matter before the council was the digging of a new shared well at the crossroads. The old well had begun to draw cloudy in the early spring, and the men of the settlement had agreed that a second well should be sunk on the west side of the road near the schoolhouse to serve the families who lived in that direction. Garrett Whitfield rose to speak after the well question had been discussed. He was 52 years old that spring, a tall, heavy man with a chest like a barrel and a beard that had gone white at the chin in the last 2 years. He owned 300 acres of the best bottom land in the township, and he had not lost a vote at the council in 11 years. He cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, while we are speaking of the water of this settlement, I would propose an additional ordinance. No household shall store biological materials not intended for human food within 1/2 mile of any communal water source. I name no one, but you all know what I am addressing." There was a murmur in the room. Sam Holloway, sitting on the third bench from the back, did not move. He looked at his boots. Reverend Theodore Coltrane rose from his pew on the left side of the meeting house. He was 61 years old, a small man with a white fringe of hair and a thin, reedy voice, and he had served the Hollow Creek congregation for 19 years. He was not a man who took the floor often. "Mr. Whitfield, I have read the scriptures for 50 years. I have read them in English and in the Greek and in the King's Old Latin. I cannot find a single passage that forbids a widow to keep bones in a shed. I have also read what passes for the law of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is more than most men in this settlement can claim. The Commonwealth is silent on the matter of bones. If you have evidence that the communal water is being fouled by the practice you describe, please present it. If you do not, I move that we return to the question of the new well." A silence settled over the meeting house. Garrett Whitfield's face went red. Reverend Coltrane sat down without looking at him. The motion failed by a vote of 14-9. The new well was approved. The council adjourned. Garrett Whitfield walked out of the meeting house with his son Travis at his elbow. Travis was 24 years old that spring. He had returned from Pittsburgh in March after 3 years working as a junior clerk for a building contractor on the South Side, and he had come home with the manners of a young man who believes he has seen the world. He was tall like his father, but he was narrow through the shoulders, and his face had the sallow color of a man who had spent 3 years indoors. He had not spoken during the council meeting. He had watched. In the wagon on the way home, his father said, "The Reverend has chosen his side." Travis said nothing. "A man can be made to regret his choices, Travis." Travis still said nothing. He was looking at the dark hedgerow that passed beside the wagon, and he was thinking thoughts that his father did not know. He had been thinking those thoughts for 2 months. He had been thinking them in the back room of the tavern in Freeport, where he went on the nights when he told his mother he was visiting friends. He had been thinking them with a bottle of corn whiskey in his hand and a head full of grievances that did not in fact belong to him. The fire came on the night of the 14th of October, 1850. It was a cold night. There had been a hard frost the previous week, and the sycamore leaves had begun to turn brown along the creek bottom. The moon was a thin slice 2 days short of new. The wind was out of the southwest, light and steady. A dog was barking somewhere in the direction of the Whitfield place. Margaret Kinsley woke at 1 in the morning. She did not know what had woken her. She lay in her bed and listened. The dog was still barking. There was another sound very faint that she could not immediately identify. It was the sound of a man stumbling. She rose. She put on her wool wrapper. She took down the iron lantern from its hook beside the door. She lit the candle inside it with a sulfur match. She opened the door and stepped out onto her porch. The dog stopped barking. Margaret walked across her dark yard with the lantern held low. She rounded the corner of her cabin. She came in sight of the stone shed. A man was crouched against the south wall of the shed. He had a small pile of dry hay heaped against the foundation. He had a flint and a piece of steel in his hands. He was striking the flint against the steel. Sparks were falling onto the hay. The hay was just beginning to smolder. He did not hear her. The wind was at her back. He was concentrating in the slow, drunken way of a man who had been drinking for hours on the sparks. She did not call out. She did not run. She stood 5 paces from him. She lifted the lantern. The light fell on his face. Travis Whitfield looked up. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. He looked at her face in the lantern light. He saw in her face no anger and no fear and no surprise. He saw a woman who had been waiting for this moment her entire life and who knew that the moment had come and who was looking at the man who had brought it to her with an expression of such complete and bottomless sorrow that Travis Whitfield, who had grown up in a house where sorrow was never named, could not bear to be looked at that way. He dropped the flint. He dropped the steel. He stumbled backwards. He turned. He ran. He ran through the dark yard. He ran down the wagon road. His boots made a small clattering sound on the frozen mud. He ran for half a mile before he stopped in the lee of a black oak at the bend of the creek, and he vomited into the leaves, and he sat down on the cold ground, and he held his head in his hands. He did not go home that night. He slept in the tack room of his father's barn with the smell of leather and horse sweat in his nose, and he did not sleep for more than 10 minutes at a stretch. He left for Pittsburgh on the morning stage 2 days later. He told his father he had been called back to the contractor's office on urgent business. He would not return to Hollow Creek for nearly 6 years. But there was another man on the dark road that night, and his name was Samuel Holloway. Sam had not been able to sleep. He had been turning a problem over in his mind for a week. A new order of saw blanks had come in from Pittsburgh, and 3 of the blanks had a flaw in the steel that he could not quite identify, and the problem had crawled into his bed with him every night for 7 nights and would not leave him alone. At 11:30, he had risen from beside his sleeping wife. He had pulled on his trousers and his heavy coat. He had walked out into the cold to clear his head. His route took him along the lane behind the Kinsley place. He had walked the lane perhaps 50 times in his life. He had no reason to walk it this night, except that he had walked it the night before, and the cold air had helped him think. He was 20 yards down the lane when he heard a man running. He stopped. He stepped behind the trunk of a young pine. He listened. He saw Travis Whitfield run past him in the moonlight. He saw the boy's face. He saw the open mouth. He saw the eyes. He looked back the way Travis had come. He saw through the trees the soft yellow glow of a lantern in the yard of the Kinsley place. He saw a woman standing motionless beside her stone shed, with the lantern held low at her side. Sam Holloway stood behind the pine tree for what he later remembered as a very long time. He did not move. He did not call out. He did not step into the lane to ask the woman what had happened. He did not run after Travis Whitfield to seize him by the collar. He did not in any way intervene in what he had just seen. He waited until the lantern light went out. He waited 5 more minutes with his hand pressed flat against the rough bark of the pine. Then he turned around and he walked home, and he climbed the stairs of his own house, and he undressed in the dark, and he lay down beside his wife. He did not sleep that night. He did not sleep the next night either. He did not sleep in any deep way for 3 full nights. On the morning of the fourth day, he walked to his forge before dawn. He stoked the fire. He took down from his rack a steel bar that he had been saving, a bar of high-carbon tool steel that he had paid $11 for the previous spring and that he had been afraid to ruin. He laid the bar on his anvil. He took up his hammer. 6 years I have mocked that woman, he said aloud to no one. 6 years. And the other night a man I called a friend's son tried to burn her alive. And I stood behind a tree, and I did not move. He brought the hammer down. He worked on the bar for 7 months. He did not finish a single blade in those 7 months that he was proud of. He cracked 4. He warped 2. He had to begin a new bar in February. But on a clear, cold morning in the 3rd week of May, 1851, he took out of his quench tub a single curved saw blade that rang when he tapped it with a small hammer, the way bells ring in a country churchyard at evensong. He laid the blade on his bench. He sat down on his 3-legged stool. He looked at it. He did not tell his wife. He did not tell his son. He did not tell anyone. He simply put the blade in a wooden box behind his bench, and he began another one the next morning, and by the autumn of 1852, he had made 11 saw blades that he believed his father, who had been a Pennsylvania smith of the old school, would have approved of. 11 blades. 6 years of failure undone in 7 months by a single quiet conversation he had been too proud in 1848 to receive. He never told Margaret Kinsley what he had done. He never told her that he had stood behind the pine tree. He carried the 2 secrets the way a man carries stones in his pockets, and he walked a little slower because of them every day for the next 2 years. In the same season that Sam Holloway was learning to draw the temper from a piece of carbon steel, Nora Pickering was hiding 3 small bars of brown soap in a canvas sack beneath the floorboard of the loft, and she was preparing at last to take them to the woman who had taught her how to make them. She walked over on a Saturday afternoon in May of 1851. She was 14 years old. The canvas sack was heavy in her hand. She knocked on the door of the cabin. Margaret opened it. "Mrs. Kinsley, I made these. They are not very good. I tried for a year and a half." Margaret looked at the canvas sack. She did not take it. She looked at the girl's face. "How did you learn, Nora?" "I heard you. The night my mother brought you. When Wesley was hurt. I was 6. I was supposed to be asleep. I heard you talking to my mother in the kitchen after about the ashes in the egg. I remembered. I kept remembering. It took me 3 years to make a bar that did not burn my hands." Margaret reached out then. She took the sack. She set it down on the kitchen table. She opened it. She lifted out the 3 bars and laid them on the wood. She picked up the smallest. She turned it in her hands. She smelled it. She scraped a small flake off the edge with her thumbnail and rubbed it between her fingers. "Nora." "Yes, Mrs. Kinsley?" "This is the work of a soap maker." The girl began to cry. She did not make any noise. The tears simply ran down her cheeks and dropped onto the front of her dress. "Nora, listen to me. In 6 years, no one in this settlement has asked me to teach them. No one has come to my door and said, 'Show me how.' No one. You are the first. Do you understand what that means?" The girl shook her head. "It means you are my first student. It means you will one day be a soap maker who is better than I am. It means I have not been alone all this time. I did not know it, but I have not been alone." She put her hand on the girl's shoulder. Nora Pickering wept harder in complete silence, and Margaret Kinsley wept too for the first time in front of another human being since she had buried her husband at sea, and the 2 of them stood in the kitchen with the 3 bars of brown soap on the table between them, and they did not speak for a long while. When Nora left half an hour later, she carried in her sack a small jar of yarrow ointment and a folded square of paper with 3 new formulas written on it in Margaret's careful Highland script. She walked home slowly. She put the formulas in a hollow brick behind the chimney where she knew her father would never look. She put the ointment in the same place. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell her brother. She did not tell anyone. She would visit the Kinsley cabin every Wednesday afternoon for the next 18 months. She told her mother when her mother asked that she was going to gather wild greens for the supper salad. She did gather wild greens on the way home. The greens covered the small parcels of dried moss and lichen and tallow scraps that she carried back in her basket, and her mother, busy with the younger children, did not ask any further questions. Nora was learning in those 18 months the whole substance of what her future would be. The summer of 1852 was warm and dry. The corn came up tall along the bottomland. The wheat looked promising on the high fields. The men of Hollow Creek began in the second week of August to plan their autumn purchases. They needed soap. They needed fertilizer for the spring planting. They needed boot dressing for the winter. They needed leather and tools and 100 small manufactured items. And they needed to order all of it before the first frost so the goods would come up from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh in time for storage before the snows. The supply merchant for the entire region was a man named Bartholomew Fenwick, who kept his warehouse in Freeport at the corner of Water Street and 3rd. Fenwick was 47 years old that summer. He was a heavy man with thinning sandy hair and a salesman's voice, and he had taken over the warehouse from his father in the spring of 1849. He drove out to Hollow Creek on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of August in a polished black buggy with a high yellow wheel, and he set up at Joseph Tillman's general store at the crossroads to take orders for the autumn shipment. The men came in throughout the afternoon. Garrett Whitfield ordered 400 pounds of bone meal, 2 cases of harness soap, 12 pairs of boots, and a tin of Philadelphia waterproofing. Elias Ashford ordered 6 side of finished Lancaster leather. Calvin Pickering ordered soap and fertilizer and a new plow blade. The Reverend Coltrane ordered 6 gallons of lamp oil. By 4 in the afternoon, Bartholomew Fenwick had collected nearly $2,000 in deposits in coin and in promissory notes drawn on the Pittsburgh Mercantile Bank, and he was sitting in a high-backed chair at the front of Joe Tillman's store, smoking a cigar and waiting for the last of the orders. Sam Holloway came in at 4:30. He had not intended to order anything. He had come in to buy a pound of bacon and a paper of nails. But he stopped at the front of the store, and he looked at Bartholomew Fenwick in the high-backed chair, and he asked in his quiet way, "Mr. Fenwick, your warehouse, is it built of stone or of wood?" Fenwick laughed. "Mr. Holloway, it is built of wood, as all the warehouses in Freeport are built. The Pittsburgh fire of '45 drove the price of brick beyond reason." "And the lamp oil, where do you store it?" "In the back, in a separate room. We are careful." "And the cordage, the pine pitch, the casks of turpentine?" Fenwick's smile thinned. "In the same room, Mr. Holloway. But as I said, we are careful. I have insurance from the Liverpool and London Company. The premium is $240 a year. I am not a foolish man." Sam Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Joe Tillman, who was wrapping a paper of nails behind the counter. "Joe, have I become a worrisome man in my old age?" Joe Tillman smiled. He liked Sam. "You worry more than most, Sam. You always have. Something about this does not sit right with me." "Sam, the man has insurance. He has been in the business for 15 years. His father before him, let it be." Sam Holloway paid for his bacon and his nails. He walked home along the wagon road in the warm August afternoon. The cicadas were loud in the high grass. He thought for no reason he could name him about the smell of pine pitch on a summer night, and the way fire moves through dry cordage, and the slow yellow color of a lamp wick that has been left untrimmed. He told his wife about the conversation that evening over supper. Lucinda was peeling a peach for the pie. She did not look up. Sam, your father worried like that too, about things that never happened. He did not answer. He thought but did not say that his father had worried about a great many things and that many of those things had eventually happened and that the others had been prevented because somebody had worried first. He did not buy anything from Bartholomew Fenwick that autumn. He was the only man in Hollow Creek who did not. The rains began on the 18th of October. The first storm was an ordinary autumn storm, 6 hours of steady cold rain that filled the creeks to their banks. The second storm 3 days later was not ordinary. The rain came down for 14 hours without slackening. The wind came up from the southeast at 30 knots and held there through the night. The small creeks of the region rose to the levels they reached once in a decade. The wagon road through Douglas Gap, the only reliable route between Hollow Creek and Freeport, was washed out in 3 separate places. 2 bridges were carried away. A section of the road itself was scoured down to the bedrock, leaving a 20-foot drop where the grade had once been. 6 days later, the mill race at the Allegheny Ferry crossing collapsed. The ferry, which had been the alternate route to Freeport, was declared unusable for any load heavier than a man on horseback. The bigger wagon loads, the supplies, the barrels, and the crates and the rolls of imported goods would have to wait until the landing could be rebuilt in the spring. On the 11th of November, in the second hour after midnight, the warehouse of Bartholomew Fenwick caught fire in Freeport. The fire was discovered by the night watchman of the adjacent grain elevator at 20 minutes past 2. The watchman ran 2 blocks to the bell at the Volunteer Fire Company. By the time the company arrived with its hand pumper and its leather hoses, the entire west wall of the warehouse had collapsed and the roof had fallen in, and the flames were rising 40 feet above the ridge line and could be seen from the high ground east of the river. The fire burned for 6 hours. By morning, the warehouse was a black foundation and a column of smoke. The adjacent store had also burned. Bartholomew Fenwick was nowhere to be found. He had left Freeport on the 7 o'clock packet to Pittsburgh the previous evening. He had taken with him his account books, his bank drafts, and $4,000 in coin and notes, which represented the autumn deposits of the entire Hollow Creek region. He had told his clerk he was going to Pittsburgh to expedite the autumn shipment. He never returned. The insurance company, the Liverpool and London, investigated the fire. They found that the lamp oil and the turpentine had been stored in violation of every reasonable practice within 4 feet of an unshielded oil lamp that had been left burning against company policy after the warehouse closed. They denied the claim. The deposits of the Hollow Creek farmers were gone. The autumn goods were gone. Bartholomew Fenwick was gone. The news reached Hollow Creek on the morning of the 13th of November when a rider came up from Freeport with a list of the missing goods and the missing man. The settlement gathered at Joe Tillman's store. Garrett Whitfield read the list aloud. The men listened. The men did not speak. Sam Holloway stood at the back of the store with his coat still on. He did not say anything. He had no need to say anything. The men had heard him in August. He had said what he had to say. He would not say it again. He walked home along the wagon road in the cold November afternoon. The wind was out of the northwest. The sycamores along the creek had dropped their leaves. He walked into his forge. He looked at his bench. He looked at the wooden box behind the bench where he kept his 11 good blades. He brought his right fist down on the anvil. He brought it down with all the weight of a 50-year-old man who had been right about a single thing in his life and had not been heard. His index finger broke at the second knuckle. He did not feel it for almost a minute. When he did feel it, he did not curse. He went home. He let his wife wrap it in a strip of linen and a wooden splint cut from a kindling stick. She did not ask him how it had happened. She had seen in the set of his jaw that this was not a question to be asked tonight. She brought him a cup of black tea. He drank it. He sat in his wooden chair beside the banked fire and he looked at the coals. Lucinda, yes, Sam. I am going to walk to the Kinsley place tomorrow morning before sunrise. I do not know what I will say, but I am going. His wife was quiet for a long while. Sam, she has been waiting 6 years for you to come. He looked at her. She had never said anything about Margaret Kinsley in their 27 years of marriage. She had not defended her. She had not condemned her. She had simply the way certain quiet women do watched. You knew. I knew. What did you know? I knew the day you came home from her cabin in April of '48 and could not sleep for a month. I knew the morning you brought home the first blade that rang true in 14 months. I knew Sam. A wife knows. He looked at his bandaged hand. He looked at the fire. He did not speak again that night. In the morning, 3 hours before dawn, he put on his heaviest coat and his fur cap. He took down from the rack above the door the bar of high-carbon tool steel that he had been saving since the spring. The very last bar he had, the one he had been afraid to ruin. He wrapped it in oiled canvas. He tucked it under his right arm because his left was still splinted. He stepped out of his house into the snow. The wind had died. The sky was clear. The stars were very bright above the bare oaks of Hollow Creek. He walked the lane he had walked behind the pine tree more than 2 years before. He walked past the place where he had stood and not stepped forward. He did not stop there. He walked on. He came to the yard of the Kinsley cabin. He came to the porch. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles touched the wood. Margaret Kinsley stood in the doorway in a white apron and a gray wool wrapper. She did not look surprised. She looked at him and at the bundle under his arm and at the splint on his left hand, and she said, "Mr. Holloway, you are early." The door had opened before he could knock, and Sam Holloway, 50 years old that winter, stood on the porch of a woman he had insulted in the spring of 1848 with a bar of high-carbon steel under his right arm and a broken finger splinted on his left hand and a feeling in his chest that he had never felt before in his life. Margaret Kinsley looked at him in the gray hour before dawn. She wore the white apron she always wore when there was work to be done. She did not step aside. She did not invite him in. She simply looked at him with that grave, steady attention he had been afraid of for 6 years, and she said, "Mr. Holloway, you are early." He took off his fur cap. He held it in his bandaged hand. "Mrs. Kinsley, I brought my last bar of tool steel, Pittsburgh tempered, $11 when I bought it last spring. I want you to use it however you see fit. I cannot pay you for what you taught me in April of '48. I cannot pay you for the blades. I cannot pay you for the silence I kept on the night I stood behind the pine tree, but I can give you the steel, and I can give you my hands, whatever you need them for." Margaret looked at the wrap bundle. She looked at his face. "Mr. Holloway, I do not need your steel." "Then what do you need?" "I need you to teach me to forge. I have 7 old saw blades in the shed. I bought them from a tinker in '51. He sold them as scrap. They will rebuild themselves into the cutting tools this settlement needs to survive the winter, but only if a smith works the metal. I cannot work metal. You can. Come inside." He stepped over the threshold for the first time in his life. He did not look at the kitchen. He did not look at the hearth. He looked only at the woman who walked ahead of him, and he followed her through the warm cabin to the back door and through the back door across the yard to the stone shed. She unlocked the iron door. She held the lantern high. He stepped inside. He saw the long racks of shelves against the north wall and the labeled barrels against the east wall and the leather hanging in graded sizes against the south wall and the small iron stove and the workbench against the west wall, and he saw in a single glance what 6 years of patient daily work could build inside the four walls of a stone shed if a person was willing to be laughed at by every neighbor in a settlement. He did not speak for a long time. Margaret did not press him. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Kinsley, I am sorry." She nodded once. "Mr. Holloway, let us begin." The work of the next 5 weeks would be the hardest work either of them had ever done, but they would do it together, and they would do it without speaking of the past again. And on the morning of the 23rd of December, when the first 6 women of Hollow Creek came walking through the snow to the door of the stone shed, Sam Holloway would already be standing at the workbench in his shirt sleeves, with his coat thrown over a barrel, and he would nod to each woman as she came in, and not one of them would dare to ask why he was there. The women came in pairs and threes, walking through the snow from their cabins along the wagon road, with aprons tied over their winter coats and their hair bound under headscarves. Hester Pickering led them. Mabel Whitfield was the second. Sadie Ashford was the third. Lucinda Holloway came as the fourth, with her son Jonas walking in beside her, and she did not say a word to her husband when she saw him standing at the door of the stone shed. She simply nodded to him, and she walked past him into the shed, and she took her place at the workbench beside Margaret Kinsley as if she had been waiting 27 years to do so. That morning, before the women arrived, Hester had asked Margaret in the warm kitchen of the cabin what payment she wished for the work. Margaret had set down her teacup. She had looked at Hester for a long while. "Hester, I have no children. I have no family in this country. When I die, what I have learned will die with me unless someone in the settlement is willing to receive it. That is what I ask, not silver, not gratitude. I want you to help me teach every person who will come. The women, the men, the children. Anything I know I will give. That is the price." Hester had covered her face with her hands then, and she had wept for the first time in front of another person in many years, because she had been carrying a secret of her own for nearly 5 years, and the secret had a name, and the name was Wesley. Margaret had reached across the table. She had taken Hester's hands away from her face. "Hester, I know, I have always known. He is 9 years old now. I know. I have wanted to tell. I know that too. Drink your tea. The women will be here in an hour. There is work to do." Hester had drunk her tea. Now the women stood inside the stone shed, and they looked at the racks and the barrels and the labeled crocks, and Margaret Kinsley set them to work. She did not lecture. She did not gloat. She simply told them one by one what each pair of hands would do that morning, and the women bent to their tasks. The first project was soap. She had chosen it because it was the shortage that touched every household most directly, and because the process required 2 days of preparation before the actual boiling could begin. She set the ash hopper in the southeast corner of the shed, a barrel with a false bottom of clean sticks, and a layer of straw in a wooden drain that led to a catch trough. She filled the hopper with hardwood ash from her second barrel. She showed the women how rainwater poured slowly through the ash dripped out below as a pale gray liquid. The first pass was weak. She floated a fresh hen's egg in a small cup of the liquid. The egg sank to the bottom. She poured the liquid through the hopper a second time and a third, and on the fourth pass, the egg rode high enough to show a circle of shell the size of a silver dollar above the surface. She lifted the egg out of the cup and showed it to the women, and she said, "Now we are ready." The rendering of the fat took 3 days. 68 pounds of animal fat drawn from her own crocks and from the fresh fat that Hester and Mabel had brought from the December butchering went into the largest iron kettle in the shed over a slow hickory fire in the yard. The women took shifts at the kettle. They skimmed the impurities. They boiled the fat with water to draw out the residual blood. They let the rendered tallow cool and harden, and they scraped the clean white fat off the top of the water and laid it aside for the soap kettle. On the morning of the 28th of December, with nearly every woman in Hollow Creek standing in Margaret's yard to watch, Margaret added the strong lye to the melted tallow in careful measured amounts, and she stirred the mixture with a long wooden paddle her father had cut for her in Aberdeen 34 years before. She stirred for 3 hours without stopping. When a drop of the mixture held on the paddle would leave a visible line on the surface of the batch, she set the paddle down and declared the reaction complete. They covered the kettle. They let it cool through the night. In the morning, Margaret produced the soft soap in a great pale mass, and she salted it down with coarse salt from a crock she had been saving for years, and the salt drew the water out of the mass and left a dense, firm paste that she cut into bars with a length of wire stretched between two wooden handles. The bars were the color of old ivory. They smelled of wood smoke and clean fat. Hester Pickering carried the first bar home that evening. She set it on the kitchen table in front of her husband. Calvin Pickering looked at the bar. He picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He did not speak for a full hour. Then he stood up. He took his coat from the peg. He walked the half-mile through the snow to the Kinsley cabin, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hand, and he knocked. Margaret opened the door. "Mr. Pickering, Mrs. Kinsley, the night of the 17th of January, 1848. I have not forgotten it. I know you have not. I told my wife to keep silent because I was ashamed. I made her carry that silence for almost 5 years. The boy I would not be seen sending for help. My son, Wesley, who I love more than my own life. I do not know how a man becomes the kind of man who does that. But I was that kind of man, and I have come to say so." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Snow was falling on the porch railing. A small drift had built up against the leg of his trouser. "Calvin, how old is your son now?" "He will be 10 in March." "Is he well?" "He is well. He runs faster than his older brother. The leg has never given him trouble." "Then you have been apologizing to me for 5 years, Calvin. Every morning that boy ran across your yard, you were apologizing. Let me hear no more of it. There is work in the shed. I need a man who is not afraid of the smell of burning calcium. Come tomorrow at sunrise." "I will come at 4. "Then come at 4. Wear an old coat. The bonfire will ruin a good one." He did not say goodbye. He walked back through the snow with his hat in his hand, and Hester met him at the door of his cabin, and she put her arms around him, and the 5 years of silence broke apart in the lamplight of his own kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The bone burning began the next morning. Calvin Pickering dug a long, narrow pit behind the stone shed and lined it with fieldstone. He built a hardwood fire in the bottom of the pit, and when the fire had burned down to a deep bed of coals, he laid the sordid bones from Margaret's 8th shelf on iron racks above the heat. The bones cooked slowly. They turned first black and then gray, and finally the chalk white that meant the organic matter had cooked off, and only the mineral calcium phosphate remained. When a batch was finished, Calvin pulled it out the racks with long iron tongs and laid the white bones on a square of canvas. The bones were crushed under a wooden mallet and then ground in Margaret's hand mill to a fine meal the color of bleached linen. The meal went into cotton sacks. He worked beside Sam Holloway for 3 weeks. The two men did not speak much during the day. There was little to say. But in the long evenings when the women had gone home to their kitchens, and only the two of them remained in the yard tending the slow coal bed of the bone pit, Sam Holloway opened his mouth at last and spoke about a night in October of 1850. "Calvin, I have to tell you something. I have been carrying it for 2 years and 3 months. I cannot carry it any longer." Calvin Pickering stirred the coals. "Then tell it, Sam. I saw Travis Whitfield try to burn this shed. October of '50. I was walking the lane behind the cabin. I could not sleep. I saw him strike a flint into a pile of hay he had laid against the south wall. I saw Mrs. Kinsley come out with a lantern. I saw her stand 5 paces from him, and I saw him drop the flint and run. I stood behind a pine tree. I did not call out. I did not stop him. I did nothing. Calvin was quiet for a long time. Sam, does Garrett know? No. Does Mrs. Kinsley know that you saw? No. Are you going to tell Garrett? I do not know, Calvin. I have not been able to decide. Then take your time. A thing like that does not get told before it is ready to be told. But Sam, yes, you will have to tell him. You know it. I know it. The boy is coming home eventually, and when he does, there will be a reckoning. You cannot let Garrett stand on the wrong side of it because you were too proud to speak. Sam Holloway looked at the coals. He did not answer that night, but Calvin Pickering's words sat in his chest the way a stone sits in a creek bed, and they would not move until the day they were lifted out. By the end of January, Calvin had produced 340 pounds of bone meal fertilizer, and the cotton sacks were stacked in the dry corner of the shed, waiting for the spring planting that would begin in April. He had not made a single joke at the Sunday gathering in 3 weeks. His wife noticed. She did not comment on it. She understood that her husband was working through a reckoning that did not require her help. The work spread to every corner of the shed in the 2nd week of January. Mabel Whitfield, who had walked to the shed on the 4th day with her mouth set in its familiar hard line, and who had said to Margaret at the doorway, "I suppose you will have me carry ashes like a servant," sat down on a wooden stool at the leather rack on the 5th day and did not stand up for 6 hours. She had grown up at the Lancaster County household of a harness maker named Quincy Ballantine, who had been her father, and she had watched her father cut and stitch leather from the time she could sit upright on a tall stool beside his bench. She had not worked leather in 30 years. But on that 5th day at Margaret's leather rack with a pile of scrap pieces in front of her and a sharp knife and a handful of copper rivets, the smith had sent over her hands remembered what her mind had forgotten. By noon, she was cutting harness straps. By 3, she was punching rivet holes with the practiced rhythm of a girl of 18. Her husband, Garrett, came by the shed late that afternoon to bring her a covered bowl of hot bean soup. He stopped in the doorway. He did not step inside. He watched his wife from the threshold for almost 2 minutes before she noticed him. She looked up. Her face was the face he had not seen in 27 years. It was the face of the girl he had courted in the spring of 1822, who had laughed at his jokes and braided rice straw into his horse's mane and walked with him along the Conestoga River after church on Sunday afternoons. The face had been there all along. He had simply forgotten how to look for it. He set the bowl of soup on the bench. He did not say a word. He turned around and he walked home, and he sat in his own kitchen for an hour without lighting the lamp, in the deep kind of silence that comes upon a man when he realizes that he has underestimated his wife for the entirety of his adult life. By the end of January, Mabel had produced more than 100 serviceable leather items from the scrap collection, 34 harness straps, 48 boot patches, 20 hinge leathers for doors and cabinets, and the smaller pieces needed for tool handles, belt repairs, and bellows patches. She did not stop working when the crisis ended. She would continue for the next 20 years to make leather goods at the workbench Margaret built her in the corner of the expanded settlement reserve, and her work would become known throughout western Pennsylvania for the quality of its stitching. The waterproofing went to Elias Ashford, whom Margaret had identified from a single conversation in his barn 3 weeks earlier as the settlement's natural harness and leatherman by temperament. She taught him the formula: 7 parts rendered tallow, 2 parts beeswax, 1 part pine pitch, with a small addition of neat's foot oil from rendered cow's feet compounded over a gentle heat in a small iron pan. She showed him the proportions once. He did not need to be shown twice. He produced 64 pounds of dressing in 2 weeks, and the tin cakes went out to every household in Hollow Creek. And within a month, every pair of boots in the settlement had been treated twice over, and the men could walk the woods again without fearing for their feet. The felting of the wool was done by Sadie Ashford and by Susanna Tillman, the daughter of the storekeeper who was 16 that winter and who had asked her father 2 months earlier whether she might be allowed to help if the day ever came when the Scots widow opened her shed. Joe Tillman had told her she might. He had remembered every day since the previous summer the silence he had not broken in his own store, and the daughter who had been standing behind the counter that afternoon, and the lessons he had failed to teach by his own example. He had told Susanna she might learn whatever Mrs. Kinsley would teach her, and that he would consider himself indebted to the woman for whatever skill his daughter took home. Sadie and Susanna produced 40 pounds of felted goods in a month. The dense gray sheets went out as boot liners and mitten liners and coat padding and packing material for the gaps in the cabin walls. Susanna would teach the craft in turn to her own daughter 25 years later, and that daughter would teach it to a granddaughter who would live eventually into the middle of the 20th century, and the line of women who could turn short wool into warm cloth would not break in Hollow Creek for 4 generations. By the middle of February, the crisis was over. Every household in the settlement had soap, fertilizer, waterproofing, leather, and the 100 smaller necessities that Margaret's shed had yielded up to the organized labor of the women and men who had come to learn at her side. But there was still one matter between 2 stubborn men that had not been resolved. Sam Holloway walked to the farm of Garrett Whitfield on the morning of the 12th of February. The snow had begun to thaw at the edges of the wagon road. The bare branches of the sycamores along the creek were glittering with melting ice. He did not knock at the front door of Garrett's house. He went around to the barn where he knew Garrett would be feeding the horses at that hour, and he opened the barn door without calling out. Garrett was standing at the manger with a fork of Timothy hay in his hands. He looked up when the door opened. "Sam, Garrett, I need a word." "Close the door." Sam closed the door. He walked across the barn floor to the manger. He put his right hand on the rough oak rail of the stall. His left hand was healed by then, but he still held the index finger stiffly. He would for the rest of his life have a crook in that finger that came of the night in November when he had brought it down on his anvil. "Garrett, I have something to tell you. I have been carrying it for 2 years and 4 months. Calvin Pickering knows, nobody else." Garrett set down the fork. He turned to face Sam fully. "Tell me." "October of '50, your boy Travis, he came up the lane behind the Kinsley cabin with a flint and a piece of steel and a pile of dry hay. He set the hay against the south wall of the shed. He tried to light it. Mrs. Kinsley came out with the lantern and saw him. She did not say a word. She looked at him. He dropped the flint and ran. I was behind a pine tree 20 yards down the lane. I saw all of it. I did not call out. I did not stop him. I did not tell you. I did not tell Mrs. Kinsley I had seen. I have been the worst kind of coward for 2 years and 4 months." Garrett Whitfield did not speak. He stood at the manger for what felt to Sam Holloway like a very long time. He turned slowly away from Sam. He walked across the barn floor to a wooden milking stool. He sat down on it. He put his elbows on his knees. He put his face in his hands. He did not weep. He simply sat there in the cold barn with his face in his hands for the better part of 5 minutes. When he raised his head, his eyes were red, but they were dry. "Sam, I did not know." "I know you did not." He left for Pittsburgh 2 days after that, And I have been wondering for 6 years what he did the night before he left. He would not tell me. He would not tell his mother. He drank for 3 days when he got to Pittsburgh. His roommate wrote me. I did not understand. Now you understand. He is coming home in March. He wrote to his mother last week. He has a position in a Pittsburgh accounting firm now, but he wants to visit. Mabel has been planning the meal for 2 weeks. Then you have a month, Garrett, to decide what kind of father you are. What would you have me do, Sam? I would have you take him to the cabin of Margaret Kinsley, alone, not with you in the room. Make him stand on her porch by himself. Make him tell her what he did. And after he tells her, make him do whatever she asks of him, for as long as she asks. That is the only road back from the kind of thing your son did, Garrett. There is no other. If you stand between him and her, you will lose him forever, and he will become the kind of man who burns sheds in the night for the rest of his life, and you will have made him. Garrett Whitfield was quiet for a long time. Sam, why are you telling me this now? Because Calvin Pickering told me to. Because the boy is coming home. Because I cannot stand at a Sunday service for the rest of my life with this stone in my chest. Because the woman in that shed saved my saw blades in 48 and saved this settlement in 52, and I owe her every truth I have left in me. That is why. Garrett rose from the milking stool. He walked back to the manger. He picked up the fork. He resumed feeding the horses slowly, as if his hands needed the work to give the rest of him time to think. Sam, thank you. Do not thank me. I do thank you. A man does not get many chances to be told the truth at 54 years of age. You have given me one. I will not waste it. Sam Holloway walked home along the wagon road with the morning sun on his back. He felt lighter than he had felt at any time since the autumn of 1850. He did not feel proud. He felt simply emptied, the way a man feels when he has carried a thing for a long time and has finally set it down in the right place. Travis Whitfield came home on the morning stage from Pittsburgh on the 11th of March, 1853. He was 27 years old. He had filled out across the shoulders. His face was no longer sallow. He carried himself like a young man who had learned in 3 years of city work to look people in the eye when he spoke to them, though there was a wariness about him that his mother could not quite place. His father met him at the front gate of the farm. The two men embraced briefly. Garrett did not speak much during the noon meal. He let Mabel ask the questions about the firm in Pittsburgh, about the boarding house, about the new suit Travis was wearing. Mabel was joyful in a way she had not been in years. She did not notice the silence in her husband. In the early afternoon, when Mabel had gone to lie down for an hour, Garrett took his son by the elbow and walked him out behind the corn crib. Travis, look at me. Travis looked at his father. I know about the night of the 14th of October, 1850. I know what you tried to do to the Kinsley shed. I have known for 1 month. I have not slept properly in that month. I have decided how this is going to go. You are going to walk to her cabin this afternoon. Alone, I will not come with you. You are going to stand on her porch and tell her with your own mouth what you did. And after that, you are going to ask her what penance she would have you do, and you are going to do whatever she asks for, however long she asks it, even if it is 6 months, even if it is a year. That is the only way you become a man, Travis. That is the only road. There is no other. Do you understand? Travis went very pale. He did not protest. He did not deny. He had been waiting the way certain men wait for this conversation for 6 years. Yes, Father. Go. Travis walked the wagon road to the Kinsley cabin in the warm March afternoon. The snow was almost gone from the ditches. The first crocuses were showing along the south side of the fence rows. He stopped at the gate. He looked at the porch. He had not seen the cabin in 6 years. It looked the same. It looked exactly the same. He walked up to the porch. He knocked. Margaret Kinsley opened the door. She looked at him. She did not look surprised. Mr. Whitfield. Mrs. Kinsley, the night of October 14th, 1850, I came onto your property with the intent of burning your shed. I had been drinking. I had been listening to my father speak ill of you for 4 years. I had built up in my head a hatred that did not belong to me and had nothing to do with you. When you came out of your cabin with the lantern and looked at me, I dropped the flint and I ran. I have not slept well one night in 6 years. I have come to confess what I did and to receive whatever punishment you choose to set. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Travis began to think she would not speak. Travis, may I ask you a question? You may. When you dropped the flint and ran, did you run because you were afraid of being caught? He did not answer immediately. He looked at his boots. He looked at the porch rail. He thought with a clarity that he had never quite allowed himself about the night. No, ma'am. I ran because you were looking at me, and the way you were looking at me made me feel like a man who was about to commit murder, which I was, and I could not bear it. I ran because my conscience was louder than my hatred. That is the truth. Margaret Kinsley nodded once. Then I forgave you that night, Travis, because you ran. A man with no conscience would have stayed. He would have struck me with the flint or with the steel and finished the work. You ran. That is the difference between a man who has lost his soul and a man who has only mislaid it. I forgave you the moment you turned. I have been waiting 6 years for you to come back and tell me you forgave yourself. He began to weep. He had not wept in 6 years. He wept on her porch, standing up with his hands at his sides, the way a man weeps when something inside him has finally cracked open. She let him weep. When he was finished, she said, Travis, I am not going to ask you to do penance for me. Your father has already done that work for you. I am going to ask you something else. Walk down to the forge of Samuel Holloway tomorrow morning at 4. He has work for you. Heavy work, hot work, the kind of work a young man does when he is learning a trade. You will work for him for 6 months. You will learn what it is to make a useful thing with your hands instead of trying to destroy useful things you do not understand. At the end of 6 months, you will know whether you wish to remain a Pittsburgh clerk or whether you wish to become a smith. The choice will be yours. The work while you are with him will be his. Travis wiped his face with the sleeve of his coat. Yes, Mrs. Kinsley. Go home. Tell your mother nothing of this conversation. Tell your father everything. He walked home in the gathering twilight. He told his father everything. Garrett Whitfield embraced his son for the second time that day, and the second embrace was longer than the first, and neither of them spoke of it again. Travis worked at Sam Holloway's forge from the 1st of April through the end of September of 1853. He did not become a great smith in 6 months, but he learned what hot iron felt like under a hammer, and he learned the slow color of steel warming up to a deep straw, and he learned more than anything what it meant to stand beside a man who had once been broken and had decided to spend the rest of his life making useful things. At the end of September, Travis told his father he was not going back to Pittsburgh. He stayed in Hollow Creek. He apprenticed under Sam Holloway for 4 more years. In 1865, in the spring after the war ended, he forged the first plow blade ever made entirely in Hollow Creek, and the blade went into the field of a young veteran named Wesley Pickering, who had returned from Cold Harbor with both legs still attached to his body, and who had married a girl from Tarentum that February. That is a matter for a longer story. Margaret Kinsley lived to see the methods of her shed spread across the western Pennsylvania countryside. A traveling Methodist minister passing through Hollow Creek in 1855 wrote an account of the settlement's material practices in a letter to a Pittsburgh newspaper, and the letter was reprinted in Journals of Agricultural Improvement. A woman from a settlement 40 miles to the north came down in 1856 to learn the soap method. By 1860, the Scottish method, as it came to be called in the region, was the standard practice across rural western Pennsylvania. She died in the early evening of the 17th of November, 1874. She was 62 years old. She had caught a winter cold in the second week of October that had settled into her lungs by the first week of November, and the cold had become pneumonia by the 11th, and she did not have the strength to fight it off. Nora Pickering, now 33 years old with 3 children of her own, and a husband named David Mercer, who farmed the bottom land south of the creek, sat at her bedside for 3 nights running. Sam Holloway, now 72, and the senior Smith of 3 counties, sat with her on the 3rd night. Margaret took Nora's hand. "The notebook, the brown leather notebook, in the trunk under my bed. It is yours. Teach it to your daughter. Teach it to your granddaughters." "I will, Mrs. Kinsley." "Nora, you were the daughter I was never given. Remember that. Remember it always." Then she turned her head on the pillow and looked at Sam Holloway, who had pulled his chair to the other side of the bed. "Sam, I am here. The last saw blade you brought me, the one you finished in October. It is the best blade you have ever made. Better than my father could have made. He was a candle maker, but he understood steel. He would have admired you." Sam Holloway, who had not wept since he was a child, began to weep. "Mrs. Kinsley, I have been a fool." "Sam, every man is a fool before he learns to be a man. You learn. That is what matters. Now go home. Lucinda will be waiting." He went home. Margaret died that night in her own bed in the cabin she had bought from Cornelius Hargrove 28 years and 7 months before. She was buried in the stone churchyard of Hollow Creek, with the whole settlement at the graveside. The stone was cut by a mason named Henry Stark, and it carried her name and her dates and 3 Gaelic words she had asked Nora Pickering to have inscribed on it. The words mean in the English of her father's country, "Nothing works alone." The stone shed stood behind her cabin for the next 83 years. The cabin itself was rebuilt twice in that time. The land passed through 3 owners, but the shed was left standing because the people of Hollow Creek would not allow it to be torn down. In 1957, the Hollow Creek Historical Society acquired the property and restored the shed to something close to its 1852 condition, with the wooden barrels along the east wall and the leather rack on the south and the 9-tiered shelf system on the north, all stocked with the materials Margaret had once kept there. A small brass plaque at the door explains what the building was and what happened inside it in the winter of 1852. The plaque has been refaced 3 times since 1957. The shed still stands. On a clear, cold afternoon in the autumn of 2026, a man of 65 stood at the door of that shed with his granddaughter holding his right hand. The girl was 10 years old. She had hair the color of dry hay and eyes that did not blink often. She was reading the plaque slowly, the way a child reads a thing she suspects might be important. She looked up at her grandfather. "Pop, was she real?" He looked at the brass plaque. He looked at the heavy oak door with the Lancaster County hinges. He looked at his granddaughter. "She was real, sweetheart, as real as you and me. And in the forge of my great-great-grandfather, 6 counties from here, there is a saw blade hanging on the back wall. He helped to make it in the winter of '52 with her hand on his elbow. We still take it down for the hard cuts." The girl was quiet for a moment. "Pop, are there still people like her now?" He thought about it. He thought about it for a long time. He looked down the wagon road where 174 winters had come and gone. "There are, honey. There always are. The trick is to find them before the hard winter comes, and to listen when they speak, even when everybody else is laughing." He squeezed her small hand once. They walk back to the car together in the gathering twilight of an October afternoon in the year of our Lord 2026, and the stone shed of Hollow Creek stood behind them in the lengthening shadows, and the words on the gravestone in the churchyard a quarter mile away caught the last of the sun. Nothing works alone.